Welcome to Chinese History Stories. Tonight, our tale begins with an old man polishing his leather boots and stroking his goatee. In the textbooks, he's the perennial punching bag. But do you really know him? You might think he's the arch-villain who signed a traitorous treaty. The truth isn't that flat. He wasn't above scolding people, and he wasn't spared bullets either. But he saw the world more clearly than most. Before you settle in, tap like and subscribe, and drop a comment with your location and the time where you are right now. History has no single truth, only the lesson that remains. If there's a figure or episode you're longing to hear, emperors and generals, poets and scholars, or even today's headline names, tell me in the comments. Your idea just might become our next story. Let's turn this channel into everyone's cozy corner for sleep time history. Alright, let's sink into tonight's story. China in the 1860 seconds was like a shop with a sprawling storefront but very little on the shelves. Foreign cannon had already blasted the doors open while the court kept saying, "We'll discuss it later." At just that moment, a man from Anhui named Li was carrying not only his abacus, but a whole stack of plans beyond the abacus. With Zheng Guofan's backing, he went legit and stepped into higher office. Li Hongzhang was a practitioner, not a salon poet. He didn't rise by reciting the classics. He clawed his way up through blood and mud. His ascent had nothing to do with elegance and everything to do with execution. He fought the Nian rebels and the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And when the campaigns ended, he didn't simply disband. He turned those troops into his own base. In today's language, he consolidated control as the tide turned. The Qing court wasn't short on literati. It was short on people who could keep the roof from caving in. Li understood perfectly. Talk on paper convinces no one. Only with command in hand does your voice carry. So he ran the army and the state in tandem, and he personally went out to attract investment and talent. He pursued self-strengthening, not to look fashionable, but to make the country stop getting beaten. The Beiyang Fleet, the Beijing Hankou Railway, telegraphs, modern artillery, factories, in a time when even laying tracks required consulting the feng shui, Li was straining to haul China forward. But he wasn't doing it alone or freely. Over his head stood the Empress Dowager Cixi, along with the pure-stream moralists and learned officials whose feet never touched the ground. Picture a threadbare quilt patched to death. Every time he tried to add a new square, he had to explain himself to the elders for 3 days. He could have quit officialdom, focused on industry, even served as a foreign advisor. Any of that would have been easier than staying in this mess. But he refused. He decided to gamble on time and on public sentiment. Reality, though, bit back. The Beiyang Fleet he built was skimped on by the court before it ever proved itself. The warships he paid dearly for went out like children who hadn't learned to swim short on fuel, short on training. Lai knew the farther he went, the closer he drew to the fire pit. He also knew that if he didn't move, no one would. He wasn't as blindly loyal as some imagine, nor merely a careerist. He grasped the nature of the system. If you want to reform it, you first have to become the hardest, most durable piece inside it, survive, and then cut. In the late Qing, he was the one Chinese official who could sit across from the great powers as an equal and talk business. He spoke the language of diplomacy and understood endurance. People called him slippery. He simply knew his position and his options. Others wanted to win glory. He wanted to keep the patient alive, not himself, the country. Almost every decision he made carried the flavor of, as long as I'm still breathing, I can hold the line a little longer. He saw through the court's rot, but still put on his robes each morning, reported to duty on time, and acted as if nothing were wrong, not out of devotion, but because he knew that if he dropped the load, what followed wouldn't be wise governance, it would be chaos. His later years were spent bracing against collapse, a navy that was underfed and undertrained, and a bureaucracy that tripped itself while fighting enemies within and without. He knew the Beiyang Fleet might lose, yet he kept pouring in funds, drilling relentlessly, even trying to dose officers with a shot of Western tonic to refresh their minds. His core wasn't perfection, it was clarity. Did he ever regret not retiring to write poetry? Maybe. But China wasn't short on poets. It lacked someone who could face the Japanese at a conference table, on a battlefield, and in opening a way forward. Li never saw himself as a peerless statesman. He simply thought, it's my turn. I can't flinch. While he was running himself ragged, Japan was quietly sharpening its blades. Li knew this, but he also knew the court's disease was slow reaction, so he could only accelerate his own part. He wanted victory. He also understood that even in defeat, someone had to hold the line at the negotiating table. Call it fate, or call it self-inflicted. This is Li Hongzhang, clear-eyed, steady-footed, able to absorb the blows. What comes next will brand him with the word humiliation, nailing him to that page in the history textbook. But in this chapter, he's still fighting, still holding, not yet with a bullet through his cheek, not yet writing those 3 infamous characters in a hall in Japan. The night is young, the wind is rising, and our protagonist's story has only just begun. The phrase self-strengthening movement sounds stylish enough, but in the late Qing it was a venture for madmen or iron-willed pragmatists. Li Hongzhang was the latter. He knew perfectly well he was trying to install an elevator in a crumbling old building, and still dove in head first. He didn't want China to copy the West wholesale, but he also knew that if you can't beat them, you'd better learn something from them. So he decided not to wait for the emperor's nod, he would act first. Laying railways, stringing telegraph lines, building arsenals. At the time, this was like lighting a fire in the Forbidden City. Picture a robed grand official suddenly telling his colleagues, we need to put up Western-style buildings, buy machines, bring in foreign experts. If that's not stirring the pot, what is? But Li dared. He understood that this was the country's last chance to stay alive. He started in Shanghai with the Jiangnan arsenal, turning out guns and cannons, then pushed tracks toward Tianjin and Baoding. More important, he built schools. He knew a pile of weapons didn't make a strong nation. You needed people who could actually use them. He sent young men abroad to Britain, France, Germany, Japan, to see the world. When senior worthies sneered, isn't that selling out the country? Li just smiled. You've read books half your lives and still can't see how the court plans to survive. He wasn't blindly worshiping the West. His guiding line was Chinese learning as the essence, Western learning for practical use. In other words, our bones remain Chinese. We're just wearing a Western suit. He wasn't chasing westernization. He was chasing deterrence, armed to the teeth, so that even if we couldn't win, we could make others think twice. That's how the Beiyang Fleet came to be. Big guns, ironclads, steam-driven warships, looming in the harbors like wakeful beasts. Li would point at them and say, these aren't toys, this is our backbone. Not everyone cheered. The pure stream moralists in the court glared at him, calling him West-leaning and unorthodox. Remember, the Qing was used to scholars running the show. Li's blend of a merchant's mindset and hands-on pragmatism looked positively alien to them. He didn't care. He held to a simple conviction. Learning doesn't hurt you, refusing to change does. Over a decade or so, he turned the Beiyang region from having nothing into the Qing's richest and most heavily armed zone. He built rail networks so troops and goods could reach Manchuria in days. He hired foreign instructors to drill soldiers. The Western formations and exercises looked nothing like the old Qing armies. He opened a school of diplomacy and the naval academy institutions that felt surprisingly close to modern universities. But the cracks showed. In court politics, his moves amounted to stepping out of bounds. The emperor bristled. Courtiers seethed. Rumors flew. Li Hongzhang harbors ambition. The realm won't be stable while Beiyang stands. He knew this was the price doers pay. He gambled that the emperor would say he was trying to save the state, not usurp it. Harder still, he knew much of it floated like paper boats on water. Was the Beiyang Fleet formidable? Absolutely. But where did its funding come from? From Li, squeezing a few provinces for every last copper. He knew any reform propped up by one man collapses when that man falls. Time and again, he memorialized the throne, urging that the self-strengthening apparatus be institutionalized, that the state truly modernize. The court never gave a clear answer. He understood why. Those at the top were afraid of reforms touching the foundations, of entrenched interests, kicking up a storm, of commoners misunderstanding and revolting. He knew he was spending the future to buy the present, and the wager left him cold with sweat. He thought about quitting. He grew old. His illnesses mounted. From his sickbed, he told his son, "What I fear most isn't losing a battle. It's looking back after doing so much and finding I've left nothing behind." That line captures the helplessness of the age. He didn't pursue self-strengthening for praise. He did it because he knew if he didn't, no one would. Don't mistake him for just a reformer. He was also a shrewd political operator. He knew how to empower and how to rein in. He put Zhang Zidong, Shang Shuanghuai, Ding Ruchang, and others in positions where they could act, while making sure none of them flew too high. He balanced, mediated, recruited, pressured, guided by experience and instinct. In a Qing system governed less by rules than by relationships, that was survival. Sadly, time waits for no one. As he pushed self-strengthening, the West had already entered a new phase. Capital plus technology. No matter how hard he worked, the best he could do was make China less backward, not truly strong. He wasn't blind to that. He simply knew the Qing state couldn't keep pace. He had already reached his personal limit. Li Hongzhang was no saint. He compromised, maneuvered, and sometimes did things less than clean. But he was the closest thing that era had to a builder who got things done. With the seal of office in one hand and a heap of scorn on his back, he tried to throw a bridge across a fractured empire. The bridge was half finished when the tide rushed in. He didn't step back. He knew this wasn't about him. He built like a man possessed not out of optimism, but out of clear-eyed pessimism. He knew that if China didn't change, the next defeat might come without even a seat at the negotiating table. And he knew that one day his name would be nailed to the pillar of shame for a treaty. Before that day, he would do everything he could to tell this country, "You aren't beyond saving, you're just too slow." A Qing official who climbed to Li Hongzhang's height was beyond merely being in favor. He was like a player running a dungeon with cheats on. He commanded troops, held the purse strings, controlled territory. Westerners addressed him as His Excellency, and foreign envoys bound for Beijing would first pass through Tianjin to sound him out. But do you think he basked in glory? Not at all. He lived every day on the knife's edge, not a foreign blade, but the one at court. the mouse cannon fire from robe-clad moralists of the so-called pure stream, forever preaching benevolence and righteousness. Li knew exactly why his power was so great, because he was the empire's designated scapegoat. If the court wished to stay steady, someone had to stand in the wind. He stood there. If he couldn't block the gust, he braced for the blame. He wasn't the emperor, yet he did the emperor's work. He wasn't a regent, yet he arranged matters touching the empire's fate for decades to come. No one dared say it outright, but everyone understood. If Li Hongzhang fell, there would be no one left to hold the pieces together. The trouble was, the higher he climbed, the closer he came to the thunder zone of imperial authority. Cixi was no fool. She could see his momentum outpacing that of the Manchu grandees. This wasn't a system where competence earns promotion, but an environment where a head that rises too high gets cut down. So Li did real work while feigning no ambition. When he built railways, he explained it was to facilitate military and civil administration. When he reformed education, he framed it as inspiring loyal hearts among scholars. When he dealt with foreigners, he salted memorials with the formulaic, "Your servant trembles." He wrapped himself carefully in the shell of loyal minister. He had no wish to be emperor. He had no wish to be a power-hungry minister made into a sacrificial victim either. Each time the court summoned him to Beijing to report, he fell ill. Each time Cixi sought a private audience, he politely declined. Not out of arrogance, but fear. One misstep, and he could tumble into the trap of treasonous intent. One episode shows his vigilance well. The court once wanted him to succeed Zheng Guofan in overall command of Liangjiang. It was a fat post, the southern gate of the empire, and everyone else clawed for it. Li pushed it away, without leaving fingerprints. His exact words: "Your servant's abilities are insufficient for so great a charge." Translated, he refused to be hoisted onto the spit and roasted under the halo of too much power. He understood power, and he understood survival. He knew that holding too much is not honor, it is calamity. Even so, caution never silenced the pure stream. At every opening, they filed memorials. He formed factions for private gain, indulged the barbarians, excluded old officials. On one memorial, he scrawled a line steeped in irony. If the court has no traitors, whence come these pure streams? He wasn't one for harsh words, but there was steel in his bones. He endured, not because the emperor trusted him, but because there was no alternative. Swap in anyone else, and the situation would come apart. He was like a repairman working amid rubble. Patch a crack on the left, the wall collapses on the right. He wasn't enacting grand designs. He was fighting to keep the state from total collapse. He knew his true adversaries weren't the foreign powers but colleagues whose tongues roared louder than cannons. Yet he dared not lash out, for open conflict would mean internecine war. He would rather be cursed as a traitor than plunge the country into a bureaucratic civil war. He sought not fame, but a few more breaths for the Qing. His signature move was advancing by retreat. Others coveted the ministry, he promoted them. Others wanted the treasury, he ceded authority. When someone memorialized that he should step down, he would resign with the tide, then be recalled by imperial decree. You think this was weakness. In truth, he had them spinning. His genius wasn't that everyone obeyed him, but that no one could do without him. He also knew Cixi would never truly trust him. Funding for the Beiyang Fleet was forever delayed. Every proposal for reform came back diluted. He scraped together money, grain, and the manpower to build a Beiyang establishment, always with a knot in his stomach. He understood it wasn't institutional, it was Li Hongzhang style. If he retired or fell, it would all reset to zero. Thus, the court both depended on him and guarded against him. He was the man you didn't want to see, but couldn't live without. Even foreigners saw it. The British called him the most cunning old fox in the East. The Japanese said he was the only Chinese official worth negotiating with. The Qing court feared both his swelling influence and his collapse. It was a tiger. They could neither ride nor dismount. His own outlook changed too. In youth, he had some fire to remake heaven and earth. By now, he understood. He wasn't a reformer. He was a master stabilizer. He wasn't opening a new era. He was trying to let the old one die more slowly. That shift wasn't capitulation. It was clarity. He had stopped dreaming. He only wished the country wouldn't lose too disgracefully. He was not without pain. In his diary he once wrote, "Late at night, waking from dreams, I know not where I am, nor in what year the nation resides. It is the torment of seeing the collapse clearly, yet having to pretend all is well." He fought every day, not to win, but to keep defeat from arriving too soon. In the spring of 1894, the sea wind was still mild, yet Li Hongzhang's brow had already knotted tight. In his small study in Tianjin, one hand gripped intelligence from Korea, Joseon. The other traced circles across a map. He knew this wasn't some minor border quarrel. One nation was probing the Qing Empire's bottom line, and another Japan was already prepared. The Qing court was not. On the eve of the Sino-Japanese War, the capital looked placid enough. Li knew that kind of calm. It was the hush before an earthquake. He was under no illusion about Japan's ambitions. His agents in Tokyo had long been sending word. Covert troop movements, well-stocked arsenals, tight logistics, every piece in place. By contrast, the Qing forces were scattered, soldiers' pay in arrears, the fleet a shell of its name. He asked the throne for funds to mobilize early and was waved off. The Korean matter can be discussed later. The fire was already licking at their cuffs. Li nearly slapped the table as he warned, "If we do not strike first, we risk a capsized boat calamity." No one listened. Empress Dowager Cixi was focused on renovations at the Summer Palace. Courtiers were still arguing whether Korea counted as a vassal. It was a kind of collective numbness. Everyone sensed danger. Yet, no one would shoulder responsibility. With no other choice, Li quietly shifted troops using his own resources. He wasn't spoiling for a fight. He wanted to frighten the other side into backing down. He knew that once the shooting started, the question might no longer be victory or defeat, but whether the Qing would still have any standing to negotiate afterward. Still, inaction meant paralysis. He wagered on seizing the initiative on a little psychological warfare to make the enemy flinch. Japan did not flinch. In July 1894, citing unrest in Korea, Japanese troops landed with startling speed. While Qing soldiers were still aboard their transports, Japanese units were already in formation and on the move. More striking still, Tokyo launched its attack with a ready-made script for the world. Qing China has invaded our Korea. To safeguard peace in East Asia, Japan is compelled to act. When Li read that line, he said only, "Our opponent belongs to a new era." He was no stranger to battle, but this time felt unfamiliar. Japan was no longer fighting with crude human waves. It fought with intelligence, equipment, and tempo. It understood propaganda, how to work the foreign press, how to dress war in the language of diplomacy. On the Qing side, commanders did not know how to issue orders, soldiers did not know how to reload, ships did not know where to coal. Everything was being laid bare. Everything was coming apart. What cut him deepest was the Beiyang Fleet. He had built it himself, poured years of labor and pride into it. In the Battle of the Yellow Sea, it was like porcelain shoved into the surf, shattered to pieces. He had staked his hopes on that fleet as a deterrent. Instead, it proved a bow that never loosed an arrow. The string was severed before it could be drawn. Li's hair turned white. Dispatches piled up. He read them in silence. Those around him said he sat the entire day, sipping only a cup of cold tea. He knew this was more than a lost battle. It was the collapse of a system. From the self-strengthening movement to the navy, from railways to diplomacy, the edifice he had tried to erect toppled at the first real collision. He had foreseen the risk. He had not imagined it would fall so fast. It wasn't that he refused to counterattack. By then, he had no cards left to play. The army was broken, supply lines cut, the capital trembling. Worse, the court turned inward, pointing fingers. Viceroy Li failed to prosecute the war. He looked at them, heart gone to ash. The empire did not lack resources. It lacked will. It did not lack opportunity. It lacked anyone willing to bear the burden. Before the war was even over, the palace was already arranging the post-war blame. Li clenched his teeth. He did not want to concede, but he knew that holding out would not defeat Japan. It would only ensure total ruin. He was not a man to act on impulse. He understood that if Tianjin fell, Beijing would be next. He did not fear his own death. He feared that if the capital were taken, the country would be thrown open to carving. So he volunteered to go to Japan to negotiate peace. He knew what that meant: curses, scapegoating, and his name forever tied to the Treaty of Shimonoseki. He knew that the moment he left the country, he would pass from reformer to fall guy. He went anyway. It wasn't that he felt no pain. He simply believed there was no time left. Wait one more week, and it might be a Japanese flag flying over the Forbidden City. He had won many gambles in his life. This time, he lost the entire era. And the man named Li Hongzhang, in the dust of defeat, slowly faded from power broker to silent elder. He was not merely a loser. He was the one who tugged open the curtain to modern China. But before the door could be braced wide, the lamp he had lit was snuffed out by the wind. In 1894, above the Yellow Sea, the wind was not raising waves so much as the last shred of an old world's dignity. As the Beiyang Fleet put out from Wei Hai Wei Wei, Li Hongzhang stood on shore, eyes narrowed to a line. He did not go with them. He knew he had to remain in Tianjin to manage the rear, and he knew those ships were the fruit of more than a decade of his effort. Yet, on the eve of departure, word had already reached him. Many of the shells aboard were aged stock. Sailors' pay had been in arrears for months. The ships are newly built. The men are seasoned, but their spirit has scattered. That was his most painful verdict on the Beiyang Navy. The problem was not the hardware. It was a corroded system and a broken morale. Time and again he had petitioned for additional funds. The court stalled, even telling him to make frugality the rule. An army without rations and a commander without authority such a force. Ironclads like mountains notwithstanding, could not withstand a modern war. On the day the Battle of the Yellow Sea broke out, Tianjin's sky was leaden. Clutching a pre-battle telegram from Admiral Ding Ruchang, he felt a chill settle in his chest. The message was brief, but every line cried urgency. He understood perfectly. This was no probe, but life and death. He dispatched the supplies through the night and released his last reserve funds, then lay awake until dawn. In the morning, the news arrived. Xiu Yuan has sunk. Deng Xichang has fallen. He froze, eyes reddening, then turned back to his desk without a word. Li Hongzhang was not lacking in steel. He simply saw too clearly. The cruiser Jiyuan was among the fleet's mainstays. Deng Xichang was a commander he himself had promoted. In that instant, he knew the Navy's lifeline had been severed. He watched the coastline on his map retreat inch by inch, like a threadbare cotton coat, spread open and then slowly drawn closed. He did not weep, but in his letter to Ding Ruchang he wrote, "The tide has turned, yet I hope the nation's dignity will not be disgraced." It was not encouragement, it was instruction. He knew that what he sought now was not victory, but a measure of honor. He wanted this shattered fleet at least not to come apart like a sodden paper boat. Reality was crueler than he had imagined. The Japanese fleet pressed the pursuit through the night and won battle after battle. The Beiyang Navy collapsed completely. Ding Ruchang took his own life, senior officers fell one after another, the remaining ships sank or surrendered. Once hailed as the strongest in Asia, the Beiyang Fleet became a heap of history's wreckage. Li read the foreign press. China's Navy died today. He did not dispute it, because it was true. It was not only a military rout, it was a collapse of faith. A decade of labor was smashed in a few days. He had once said, "If we succeed, we open a new age. If we fail, we may yet leave a sliver of hope." Now even that sliver was gone. He knew the defeat at sea marked the end of the self-strengthening movement. His entire program of strengthening through technology had been publicly broken on the battlefield. What weighed on him even more was the court's response. When word of defeat reached the capital, the Empress Dowager Cixi flew into a rage, and her first thought was, "Has someone betrayed us?" She wanted not to stem the loss, but to find a scapegoat. Li Hongzhang was named in order to submit a detailed account of the battle and the causes of failure. He complied, but did not argue in his own defense. He wrote only, "I know my guilt, yet the affairs of the state are grievous, beyond the strength of one man." He made it plain, this was not Li Hongzhang's problem alone. It was the sickness of the entire state. But the condemnations surged like a tide. In the streets, people passed around jokes about the paper ships of the Beiyang Fleet and cursed Li, the Grand Secretary who ruined the nation. Some even hurled stones outside his Tianjin residence. He stood at the window, watching young men shout for the traitor to be punished, his face unruffled. "I do not fear being reviled," he said. "I fear that no one will shoulder responsibility anymore." He knew too well. The court wanted a placebo, and he was the easiest pill to swallow. He had indeed thought of resigning. He submitted a memorial stating plainly, "After the Beiyang defeat, I have no face to remain in high office. I beg to resign." The court refused, instructing him instead to remain and handle the aftermath. He read the meaning at once, keep carrying the blame, and step down only after every fault has been pinned on you. He sighed and replied, "I obey." Yet none of this broke him. On the contrary, he began to prepare for negotiations. He knew that with a fleet destroyed, next would come defeats on land. The gates to Beijing and Tianjin would be hard to hold. He could not wait until the Japanese were at the capital to discuss terms. He had to move first to secure for the country the least bad way out. He gathered his diplomatic staff, reviewed every prior exchange with Japan, and even pored over Japanese domestic politics and public opinion. He was not haggling. He was searching for any faint opening within an inevitable defeat. He was not aiming to win, but to avoid losing utterly. At this stage, he changed completely. No more talk of ideals, no more Chinese learning as essence. He spoke only of realities. If we delay, the capital will be lost. If the capital falls, the state cannot be preserved. He wrote the sentence into his memorial, the tone cold and stripped of ornament. He knew that if Cixi still forbade him to negotiate, it would not merely be the death of a nation, it would be the end of the dynasty. And so the old man, denounced as a national bungler, put on his armor once more, not to lead troops, but to wield a pen, not onto a battlefield, but into a theater, stage for him to sign and shoulder the blame. He knew that this time no one could save him, not even he himself. Still, he chose to go because he knew if he did not, there might soon be no one left to sign at all. At the start of 1895, when Li Hongzhang stepped onto the ship bound for Japan, the sky was as black as the bottom of a cauldron. He stood on deck with the sea wind cutting cold. He knew this journey was not for glory, but for disgrace. Still, he didn't frown. He had long since grown used to being pushed along by events. After defeat in the Sino-Japanese War, losses on land and sea, the court had finally awakened, but far too late. He was not going to negotiate victory. He was going to stanch the bleeding. Before he left Tianjin, the Empress Dowager Cixi said only one sentence. "Grand Secretary, on this journey, you must preserve the dignity of the nation." Li bowed and assented. As he turned away, no one saw his fingers tremble twice inside his sleeve. He understood that this time he represented not a single man or a single bureau, but the face of the entire court, the last presentable facade of a crumbling empire. He was the final, fragile veneer. Shimonoseki, a small harbor town ringed by mountains, hosted the talks in the Shumpanro Pavilion. The building wasn't tall. Its windows were clear and bright, yet the air felt so heavy one could hardly breathe. Across the table sat Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi and Foreign Minister Mutsu Munemitsu. Li looked at them and felt his heart sink. These were no ordinary politicians. They had taken the Qing's measure and seen the sickness within. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to confirm the outcome. On the first day, Japan laid out its terms: cede Taiwan, the Pescadores, and the Liaodong Peninsula, pay an indemnity of 200 million taels of silver, open ports to trade, and recognize Korea's independence. Li was not surprised, but he still closed his eyes for a moment, sat in silence, and finally replied, "Allow me to report back to the throne. It wasn't refusal, it was delay." He knew nothing could be settled in the first round. The first move was to drag things out. The next days were spent in stalemate. Li relied on his usual tactic: softness edged with steel. He did not refuse to concede, but he advanced one step and then halted, trying to claw back the smallest sliver of speaking room. He wasn't trying to win, he was trying to lose less. He clung to every detail. Could the indemnity be trimmed? Could the new treaty ports be postponed? Could Taiwan be only temporarily transferred? He didn't believe Japan would agree, but he needed to show a posture. The Qing might be defeated, but it would not grovel completely. The other side was ready, Ito met him with an affable smile. Mutsu watched with a cold eye. They knew Li had not come to haggle, but to rubber stamp. Before the seal could fall, however, he had to enact a few symbolic struggles. For them, this was ceremony, a way to make the Qing understand that from now on it had lost the right to say no. Li gritted his teeth and held fast. By day, he argued point by point at a table. By night, he returned to the legation and spoke hardly at all. He carried a small pipe and lit 3 bowls of tobacco each evening, one after another, smoking past midnight. When attendants urged him to rest, he only waved a hand. Back home, there will be no rest either. He knew the country had already lost. All that remained was how to write the character defeat. Then, in April, a sudden turn. As Li returned to the legation, an assassin shot him. The bullet tore through his left cheek. Blood covered his face. He fell, attendants cried out, guards panicked. Half conscious, he still struggled to say, "Do not panic. The wound is not serious." That single shot shocked the court and startled the world. The Japanese government apologized at once. Ito called personally to offer regrets and even announced a temporary suspension of the talks. Foreign papers reported, "Blood has been shed at the negotiating table. The civilized world cannot accept this." Li understood that this bullet might be the thread of providence thrown his way. In the days after he was wounded, the mood changed abruptly. Japan proposed moderate adjustments, willing to make a symbolic reduction of 5 million taels and to postpone the issue of the Liaodong Peninsula's disposition. It was the pose of concession while keeping the initiative, but Li sensed an opening. He quickly shifted tactics, comparing 24 draft copies line by line, and finally settled on the most bearable version of disgrace. He did not rejoice at a bullet. He was simply grateful to have a pretext for a turn. He could say to the court, "I have done my utmost." To the people, pain bought us a reprieve. To history, I did not lose everything. It was not victory. It was the maximum preservation of face. Before he left for home, he stood for a moment beneath the cherry trees outside Shumpanro. The blossoms were at their height, falling with the lightest breath of wind. He murmured, "Just like our country fair to the eye, already hollow within." His attendant heard and froze, not daring to answer. He understood. Li was not lamenting the flowers, but himself and the Qing itself. On the day of departure, Li brought no excess luggage, only the signed treaty clutched close at hand. He knew that the moment he set foot on home soil, the scolding would begin, the accusations would rain down. But he also knew that if he didn't sign, no one could. If he didn't bear it, those who followed would fare worse. He chose to be the man who took the blame, not the man who let the country keep bleeding. When Li Hongzhang brought the Treaty of Shimonoseki back to China, what greeted him was not welcome or sympathy, but a blaze of fury. From Beijing in the north to Guangzhou in the south, gentry, scholars, and commoners cursed in unison. Traitor, Han, collaborator, source of national shame, wanted posters with his portrait hung on walls. Newspapers ran page after page of purist denunciations. It was as if he'd been fastened to a cross for the whole world to hurl stones at no explanation permitted. He offered none. He shut himself inside his Tianjin residence. On the rare occasions his name appeared on official documents, it was only 3 characters. Li Hongzhang. No preface, no defense. Some urged him to write an apologia, if only as a record. He shook his head. I needn't speak. In 100 years, justice will be done. It wasn't confidence, it was clarity. He knew explanations were useless. The country did not want answers. It wanted catharsis, and he was the perfect target. As for the Qing court, it left him untouched in appearance while quietly pushing him to the margins. He was still the Beiyang minister with a stack of honorary titles, but the real levers of power were gone. He understood his fate, to be used and then discarded. He had never expected imperial gratitude. He knew the system too well. Rather than seeking someone who understands me, he said, I would prefer not to be obstructed. He had grasped that in the self-strengthening era. Now he held to it more completely. He did not withdraw entirely. There was breath left in him and a last measure of duty. The status of the Liaodong Peninsula had been left in suspense in the treaty. Soon after, Russia, Germany, and France jointly intervened, demanding that Japan return Liaodong. Sensing a chance amid the great power tug of war, Li turned to Russia and concluded a secret Sino-Russian agreement to secure its backing. He was condemned for inviting the wolf into the house. He did not deny it. He merely said, if a wolf will bite, better to bring it to the table. That was his approach then, counter power with power. He knew it was no long-term solution, but he also knew the Qing had no time for the long term. With no good cards in hand, he snatched at every bad card that passed. It was not that he cared nothing for principle. Rather, the times were past the point where moral purity alone could save anything. Behind the diplomatic maneuvering, what weighed on him most was the brand of humiliator of the nation. Late at night, he would leaf through clippings from the foreign press, their words cool and cutting. China signs its most humiliating treaty, the dying wail of the sick man of the East. He did not dispute the facts. He only wanted to know whether things could have been otherwise. Again and again, the answer came back, no. He thought of resigning, but never fully did. He knew that as long as he remained, some people would still listen to him. He also knew that if he fell, the few faint stirrings of renewal might dissipate at once, so he still offered counsel now and then, advice, persuasion. He no longer hoped to accomplish great deeds. He only hoped to keep things from getting worse. During this time, many came to see him, former subordinates, young officials, students, freshly returned from overseas. He never turned them away or put on airs. He repeated one line. What you must do is what I failed to do. It wasn't chicken soup. It was a handover. He knew too well that his generation could not overturn the age. Only the next might avoid repeating its mistakes. Someone asked him, My lord, do you have regrets? He was silent for a while, then said, I have no time for regrets. I only know this. Had I refused to sign, posterity would not call me a traitor, but the country might have vanished on the spot. He said it without heroics, as if noting the weather. He wasn't angling for sympathy. He just didn't want future generations to think he signed out of stupidity. He knew he had signed shame and poison, but not signing would have been immediate execution. To his son, he said, An official must know where to stop. His son was puzzled. Haven't you kept going, bearing slander all the while? He smiled. Knowing where to stop isn't hiding. It's knowing where the wall stands. When it must be struck, strike it. When it cannot, go around, but never stop moving. That was his core, lucid and relentless, gentle yet unyielding. He was no saint and no turncoat, only a man caked in mud who still tried to stand straight. Even in those darkest days, he wrote poetry. The brushwork was rough, but each line glowed like the last light of sunset. In one verse, he wrote only 2 lines. After 100 restless years, on the day I return, a single weather-beaten page, tears drench my lapel. He left it unfinished and crumpled it. He was no hand at confession, but those few words said enough for a life. Li Hongzhang did not live to see the day he was understood. He knew that understanding is not a gift for the living. He chose to sink himself into history, letting later generations dissect and chew on his deeds. He offered no defense and asked for nothing. He merely stood, silent, on the ruins of a collapsing state, tucked the hand that had signed into his sleeve, and gazed at the flag, snapping in the wind without a word. In 1901, Li Hongzhang was 79, hair white as frost, the gunshot scar on his left cheek still savage. He never spoke first about that bullet, and he never once defended the signatures he had put down. He knew he had swallowed every curse he deserved, and many he did not, yet he had not fallen. The Qing court still needed him, this time to negotiate peace with the Eight-Nation Alliance after the Boxer upheaval. When he stepped up to the Western powers' bargaining table, his back bent slightly, his pace slow, the scar on his face saying more than words. He was no longer the poised, quick-tongued Grand Secretary of old, but a new petitioner for peace, body mapped with old wounds. The Westerners looked at him with a complicated gaze, respect, pity, and a touch of irony. He had become the very byword for the Qing Empire's negotiator, the living fossil wheeled out whenever a war ended. But Li knew there was no time to dwell on that. The country was splitting, the city walls were falling, the emperor had fled, the common people were unmoored, and he still had to sit there and write. Drained and spent, he went back and forth each day between the conference hall and his lodgings, handling dozens of diplomatic notes. His speech had slowed, but his phrasing remained precise. "If we cannot settle this time," he said, "we will lose even the right to sit down and talk." One by one, the clauses of the Boxer Protocol were laid out on the table: indemnities, apologies, executions, garrisons, each heavier than the Treaty of Shimonoseki. He understood perfectly. This was not the continuation of defeat. It was the omen of a nation's ruin. He could no longer change the great tide. All he could do was clutch at the last lines in the details. It was like picking up sparks in the night, afraid that a gust of wind would snuff out even the embers. This time, he did not say, "Your servant knows his guilt," nor, "I beg leave to speak for the state." He simply signed as usual, then looked up and told the other side. "A signature does not mean we assent. It means only that for now we have no choice." Foreign correspondents put the line into their dispatches that day. It became the last hard sentence of Li Hongzhang's late years. On the journey back to the capital, his illness worsened. He coughed blood day and night. Doctors urged him to rest. He shook his head. How can I rest when the country is not at rest? He knew, too, that his time was short. Those around him urged him to compile his life, prepare his tomb, settle down. He said lightly, "Let the epitaph read only, Li Hongzhang, Grand Secretary." 5 plain characters, his own final verdict on a life. A month later, he died in Beijing. When the news spread, reactions varied. Some said, "At last, the traitor is gone." Others sighed, "For all his failures, he was a man we could ill afford to lose." His coffin traveled from Tianjin back to Hefei. Many came to see it pass, most of them silent. In life, he had been reviled too loudly. In death, a hush. The court granted him a state funeral. Empress Dowager Cixi bestowed a plaque reading "Zhongke, loyal and conscientious." But hanging those words outside his shrine was, more than anything, a way to soothe public anger. He no longer cared for such titles. He knew that whether people called him loyal minister or arch-villain could not alter the track of his days, signing and shouldering, again and again stepping forward when no one else wished to. His final words to his descendants were brief. Do not chase empty fame. Do not fail real work. He was not teaching them how to keep themselves safe, but how to be people who can do what must be done and withstand what must be borne. He never thought himself a great man. He was simply the one who, in countless moments when no one would step up, had no choice but to go on. A century later, the debate over Li Hongzhang has not ceased. Some call him a conservative, some a sellout, some a man clinging to office. Yet, if you open his memorials, his negotiation minutes, his orders moving troops and supplies, you'll see he had not a single easy day. He was not without fault, but he was one of the few who could confront mistakes with a clear head and still push forward. He never said, I have no regrets. What he did with his whole life was this. He bought the empire a few more years of breath before collapse, so that those who came after could stand on the ruins and say, we are still here. That we, ragged and scarred as it was pieced together from his blood, his disgrace, his signatures, his compromises, one strained breath at a time. A wind moves through the long corridor of the old house, lifting a few yellowed pages of letters. Li Hongzhang's handwriting is mottled now, the press strokes deep and shallow, like his life. Some lines are firm and forceful. Others look as if his hand were shaking on the brush. Night has deepened. All is still. You may close your eyes now, lay your worries down, and sleep well. The story's over. Good night.